Happy Monday to you guys. Wanted to start another video here. It's be a kind of a short one, but it's got some lessons here, you know, stuff that you run into. Everybody's had these problems they have where what you're seeing doesn't seem to make sense until you get to the other end of it. I have also seen other situations that even though I figured out what was wrong and managed to defeat it in the end, I never could figure out why things happened the way they did. Let me aim my camera a little better here. That's better. Alright, so Mom's 91 Chrysler mystified my dad. He called me and he said the power loss light's on. That's the early version of Chrysler's check engine light. They didn't say check engine, it said power loss. To get the code out of it, you'd switch the key on 3 times and leave it on the last time, and it would flash out these 2-digit codes. And it gave a code 17, which is kind of like a P0125 today. It's like you're running too cold. And I told him, I says, you know, he's an old school mechanic, you know, he ran a shop for 30 years, but I said, switch that key on 3 times and look at those lights blinking. He said, I'm not fooling with that. So I went over there and did it. And I said, this thing needs a thermostat. He says, well, I can replace the thermostat. And so he took it to his shop over there, which he was retired by that time, but he still had his shop. He changed the thermostat, and a week later, he decided to go back over there and change the oil. And he called me and he says, all I did was change the oil, and it won't idle now. And I said, well, remove the battery cable, clean the throttle body, reconnect the battery. So he did that, and it fixed it. So in order, see, he had no concept of fuel trim, because everything he had worked on was either a diesel or it had carburetors and all that kind of thing. And there wasn't any fuel trim there. It ran a little bit rich because, you know, when it was running cold, for as long as it did, and fuel had contaminated the oil. Of course, anytime you drive too long without an oil change, fuel is going to contaminate the oil. The PCV system was picking up those fuel vapors. The oil change removed the fuel vapor. See, the adaptive learning had compensated for the fuel vapor. When the fuel vapor that it was used to breathing was gone, it was like a carburetor that was out of adjustment. It just wouldn't idle. The adaptive learning needed to be erased. So whenever he disconnected the battery, you know, always likes to, you know, the stalling was fixed. But I had other people call me and say, hey, I replaced the battery on my Dodge truck and it won't idle anymore. And I said, well, rather than going through the procedure of telling them how to clean the throttle body, I said, just drive it around for 30 minutes and it'll learn how to idle again. But it's always a good idea when you're doing anything that's got to do with fuel trim. It don't matter if you're fixing for a P0171 or whatever, pull the battery cable off. And, you know, if you've noticed fuel trims that were way out of kilter, once you find out what the problem is, pull the battery cable off, let it sit there for a little bit while you're, you know, with the battery off while you're doing your fix. Once you get it fixed, or fix what you found, then you put the battery cable back on, you crank it up, and you watch that short fuel trim, because long and short fuel trim will be at 0 right after you put the battery back on. And when it closes loop, if that short fuel trim starts walking really fast in one direction or another, you're not done and you need to work on it some more. That's just the way that I used to do all that. See, a lot of the times you might say, well, I fixed that vacuum leak, I'm done with that. But you better go back and monitor that fuel trim as soon as it closes loop the next time. As far as that thermostat goes, I was working on a Crown Victoria one time. It was one of the college cars, doing some maintenance on it. And I used to hook this wireless vehicle interface up and put the engine temperature on a big screen over there, you know, 20 feet away, so I could just look and see what the engine coolant temperature was. And that one was running, it didn't throw a code, but it was running, it was only running about 170 degrees. And that was fully warmed up as much as it was going to warm up on a normally warm day in the shop. And so I said, that's interesting. And you know, those Crown Victoria 4.6s have got a really easy thermostat to change. You can change the thermostat 3.5 minutes. And you know, if you got a power tool to spin the bowls off. And so I had a thermostat in stock for that vehicle sitting over there on the little shelf above the coffee table. And so I switched that car off, and you know, it was reading 170, and I had let it warm up plenty long enough to get hotter than that. And I said it needs to be running about 210. And so I switched the car off, pulled the thermostat. See, it wasn't even under any pressure, really, because it was warm enough to where it was as warm as it was going to get, but it wasn't hot enough to have a lot of pressure in it at the time. So in that particular instance, I was able to squeeze the hose. I could tell it didn't have a whole lot of pressure, plus it was running cold anyway. So I spin those bolts out, lift that thermostat out, set another thermostat in there that was new, put it back on, zipped it back down because it had a rubber O-ring, cranked it up, and within 5 minutes that thing went right on up to like 198. It was just really amazing to me how fast that straightened that out. A lot of times we don't even think about how quick we can determine that there's a fix there. The Taurus company car. This car had 365,000 miles on it with no significant issues, and this guy named Buck drove it doing dealer transfers. He'd haul salesmen to other dealers to bring back cars that had been, like if somebody comes in, they special order a car, and they call around to the other dealers and they say, yeah, we got one that's that color that's fixed up like that, and they say, well, we'll dealer transfer it, from that dealer to this one. And so what they do is he'd load salesmen up in this blue 92 Taurus wagon, and he would drive over there to wherever dealership was in Mobile or Montgomery or Albany or wherever, and the salesman would drive the vehicle back. But anyway, he comes in there one day and he goes, hey, this thing needs wiper blades. I said, okay. So I went right up here and popped some wiper blades on it. It was a company car anyway. Next day he comes back and says, hey, since you replaced those wiper blades, that wiper motor's making noise. Well, what I did had nothing to do with the wiper motor making noise. I don't know why he didn't notice that before, unless there was more drag on the windshield. I don't know. Well, I put a wiper motor on it. It wasn't a big deal one way or another. But see, he was trying to blame me for the noise it was making because I put in, and he was one of those kind of people, you run into people like that. All right, my sister's 77 Caprice. Dad does brake pads. After he's done, she discovers the radio don't work. She finds a blown radio fuse, replaces it, it blows again. She replaces it again, it blows again. She blamed Dad. And my brother even would say, hey, well, he must have done something wrong because that radio was working when it went into his shop. And I said, oh, that's so much a hogwash. I've seen that kind of thing too many times. So what I did was I went and took the radio out. And you might notice this radio here, those old radios like that, they had screws holding the top plate on the radio. Real easy to take the top of the radio off and you can look down in there. But I noticed the reason I did that was because whenever I had the radio in my hand with the wires plugged in and I wasn't touching the metal part of the dash, it wouldn't blow the fuse. But as soon as I touched the metal part of the dash with the radio, I heard the fuse go pop. I said, this is inside the radio. So I pulled that cover off, found a big old capacitor right there in the very top of it, close to the back, that looked about like something you'd see, a condenser distributor. And it was basically strapped to the body of the radio, and it had a wire going to the circuit board. So when I clipped that wire going to that condenser, it didn't blow the fuse anymore. So I got an old condenser out of a distributor and put it in there, replaced it with that, and she never had any more trouble with the radio. The point is, Dad replacing the brake pads had nothing to do with it blowing that radio fuse, but it was hard to convince even my brother and sister of that, because they're in their reasoning, they were thinking, well, if it was working when it went into the shop and now it's not working, it had to have something to do with that. One time there was this guy that had his food truck. He basically was working for a company, had his 1-ton food truck with a gas burner in it. And he had it, the wrecker brought it in, and he was there with it because he was going to, once it was fixed, he was going to go in and run his route or whatever. And it came in on the hook, no start. And so I checked, and the coil was weak. And then popped the coil wire off and tried to stretch the spark. It was about 1/4 of an inch is all it would jump, which they claimed in the textbook that was enough, but it's not. This thing ought to be an inch long and scare the daylights out of you. I'd stretch that spark. I wanted to see a blue lightning that you just knew was going to reach around there and hit you. And I say, if I didn't see blue lightning, I knew there was going to be, a weak ignition coil. And so I popped an ignition coil on there and fired it up. And he says, well, I ran this thing out of gas yesterday. Did that have anything to do with the coil going bad? So, well, you might be able to build a case for it, but you're running into right now what we do all the time. We do something else goes wrong. They're assuming that we did it because it went wrong after we did the work. I had one guy at college that every single time he brought his vehicle in here, he would try to blame something on us. We did brakes one time on his Ranger, and it was a four-wheel drive. And we never removed the rotors. As a matter of fact, we could machine them on the vehicle then. And we just, machined the rotors on the vehicle and put the brakes in there. And he came back about a month later, and he says, whenever y'all did those brakes, y'all messed up one of my wheel bearings. I said, what are you talking about? He goes, I got wheel bearing noise that I didn't have before you did the brake. And I said, look, every time you come in here, you're claiming that whatever next problem you have is connected somehow to the last problem, and you're wanting to guilt us into doing something for free. That's not happening. And I said, if you don't stop doing this, I'm going to stop working on your vehicle in here, because I'm not obligated to work on anybody's vehicle in this college automotive department. And that kind of got him to clean up his act. But he wasn't the only customer I ever saw like that. Some of them, no matter how hard you worked or how good the work you did was, they just weren't satisfied, and they felt like somehow you had messed it up, Now, sometimes we do mess it up, and I'm not saying that it never happens, but a lot of times. This one lady that we worked on her Saturn and did a bunch of work to pull the intake off. I talked about that one before. We put an oil cooler in there because it had a bunch of oil in the water. And she came back after we got all that mess fixed, and she said, this thing's making a whistling noise it wasn't making before. And it turned out that the header pipe gasket, which on that one was just a thin piece of metal, was burned out. And we had nothing to do with that. And I got a little ticked off with her because she was trying to blame it on us. Well, before y'all fixed all this other stuff that didn't cost me much because y'all don't charge labor, now I have this other problem that you caused. But we fixed that. But, I told her I didn't appreciate her trying to connect the dots and claim you caused this problem whenever you did this other work, So, anyway. Well, when we do cause a concern, in the early days it was said radial tires shouldn't be cross-rotated. I don't know if that was truly the case or not. I do know that I cross-rotated some radial tires on a Volkswagen Bug I was driving. It may have been because they were old and one of the tires blew out. My brother's 82 Cadillac developed radio static, and I was trying to figure out why he had radio static that would just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They had a bent spoke on one of his wheels, this one, the right front one. And he was noticing that they had cross-rotated the tires when he told them not to. Now, like I say, some people say, well, radial tires have never been a problem cross-rotated. Well, I will tell you something. When we put these tires back where they were, in other words, put the bent spoke back where, see, they had actually taken the one there and put it here, and taken the one here and put it there, some kind of way. But when we took this one here and put it back there, which is because of the bent spoke on the wheel, he knew that's where it went on that 82 Cadillac that he had, and we put them back where they were. And after that, all of his radio static was gone. There must have been a loose belt in one of those tires that was generating some RFI static electricity or something like that. I saw that firsthand. Well, this 96 S10 Blazer had his CFI Spider system. I don't know if you're familiar with those or not, but they're supposed to have 61 psi to start. If it had below about 58 or 59 psi, it would either start hard or not at all. If you check the fuel pressure on one of these, and and it's showing 61 is the norm in your specs, if you've got 55 psi, it will not operate these puppets. There's little solenoids in here that let bursts of fuel go to these little puppets. And the replacement, or these have the electronic injectors way down here that work a lot better than the old junk that General Motors really put on there. And even at the GM dealer, they replaced this Spider with one that's got wires going down to electronic injectors here. And we've done it on some vehicles there at the college. But anyway, this is the fuel pressure regulator. Notice it's got a vacuum port, but there's no vacuum hose hooked to it, because this is all underneath the intake plenum anyway, and it looks like this. But we found out that it needed a fuel pump, and I said, okay, this has got to have a fuel pump, and it wouldn't hold pressure when it shut down and all that. So we put the fuel pump on it and took care of the hard start long crank problem. No big deal. Well, Second repair, the rear main seal was leaking. We yanked the transmission and the flywheel, and we replaced the rear main seal and the torque converter seal. While you got it off, may as well go ahead and replace the torque converter seal, because the torque converter will droop, and if the seal is beginning to get a little hard, if you just pull it off and leave the torque converter in place and put a rear main seal and put it back on, you may have a transmission leak you didn't have before. So the best thing to do is go ahead and jerk the torque converter out there, replace that torque converter seal, and then put that little, on this transmission here, put that little lock-in thing on there that keeps the torque converter seal from blowing out of there. Because on these GM transmissions, sometimes it would blow the seal out. You know, that was and so they had to put this little, it's got little teeth on it that bites, but it goes in there and it provides additional support for that seal. You got to put that back in there too. Anyway, that's another story. So he called and said, hey, my inside electric hatch release won't work. So I said, how in the world could we have caused that working underneath the vehicle when you pull in the transmission and put it back? But, so let's give the old boy the benefit of the doubt. He seemed like a nice guy. You know, I hadn't done a lot of work for him before, but I wasn't going to give him a hard time. I said, well, bring it in. We'll just see what it is. Anytime they say this, a smart thing to do is to see what's going on. That way you can connect the dots yourself, and you need to be honest if it was something that you caused or that your shop caused. And so, you know, instead of trying to duck out of it. Well, first things first, always start with the fuses. The schematic showed that the courtesy fuse in the inside fuse panel feeds the rear hatch release circuit. That's the quick and easy thing to check first. I remember whenever I went and taught a class on electronic diesels to the Border Patrol mechanics out in Texas, there was this Border Patrol mechanic chief out there that was a supervisor of all these 25 guys that were working at that station. He said that they had put radios and lights and stuff in one of the SUVs that they had got from the GM dealer, and after that the ABS light was on, and so he took it back over there, and the GM dealer worked on it for 2 days, and finally found out that one of his people, when they were putting the lights in there, had either removed a fuse and didn't put it back, or had put a fuse back in the wrong place, and that's why the ABS light was on. And because they had to work on it 2 days to find a fuse that was out of place, they wanted to charge him $1,700, which was like tons and tons of labor, because the mechanic they had working on it wasn't smart enough to check the fuse first. That's the first thing he should have done, was gone to the fuse panel. But no, he went everywhere else, and they wanted to charge for all of his time. And I guess they probably got that money, but I told that guy, I said, you do not owe that GM dealer $1,700 of government money, because that knothead didn't check the fuse before he did a whole bunch of other work. That was just, you know, poor troubleshooting procedures. Anyway, first thing we did is check the fuse. Nothing wrong with the fuse. Alright, so this is where the fuse was. The fuse panel on the end over there, and this courtesy lamp fuse was right along in here somewhere, and we found out that fuse was not blown. Well, that's good. Now, anytime you're looking, back in the day when people used to use the fuse panels to draw power from stuff like cell phones and whatever junk, they don't do that much anymore. But they had these little things that you would put on the leg of a fuse that would have a little spade connector on it, and you shove it in there, and it would spread those fuse terminals in the fuse panel out, so that the fuse, the leg of the fuse wouldn't touch, because you'd spread it out too much. You basically had damaged the fuse. And if you didn't have that, if you took that little power tap off of that leg of that fuse, stuck the fuse back in there, you might have a situation where it's not touching. You know, where it was like this, all of a sudden it's like that. And so you can check the fuse and find out there's power on both sides of the little fuse, checking it with a test light here and here, and it still not be getting to where it's going. Now, that wasn't the case here, but I had run into that in previous cases, and you got to do something to fix that. Which a lot of times what I would do is just twist the fuse terminal a little bit and stuck it back in there if you want to do a quick fix. The right way to fix it would be to try to get in there and do something to that terminal, which is really hard to do, or replace the fuse panel, which is expensive and aggravating. Anyway, so we were turning on the switch, we had power going all the way actuator. So we checked at the actuator, turned on the switch, there was power there. Alright, so it says, alright, so we got power to the actuator when we mashed the button, so what the heck is going on here? You don't know the power of the dark side. That's what I used to tell my, the dark side is the ground side. But we never had a ground at any time on this side of the actuator. Well, if you don't have ground, you're not going to have actuation. And so what it turned out was we homed in on the problem. It irritates me when they say hone in on something, but the right word is homing in, like missiles on a target, because that's what we did here. The neutral safety switch connector, whenever Raymond put the transmission back in, he didn't quite plug it in all the way. Now the reason for that was, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen this if you've been around a while, GM, you got these weather pack connectors that are supposed to keep the moisture out of there, but that wasn't good enough for them. They had to put a whole bunch of gummy, gluey crud in there. It was supposed to absolutely seal it against all kinds of moisture. And it's really, really, really hard to get that thing unplugged. Now, if you put a hairdryer on it or a heat gun and you warm it up some, that stuff will get soft and you get that out of there. But these two terminals right here were the ones that were feeding the neutral safety switch. Neutral safety switch. If you're supposed to, the park brake does this on a manual transmission, but this one here was an automatic, and so there was no ground being fed to this. It was plugged in enough to where everything else was working, including the backup lights, but that one connection wasn't quite good enough to let that actuator work. So this was something we actually caused. All right, we had messed up. Now it pays to give them the benefit of the doubt, and that's what we did. And this guy drove away happy, and we actually made good on that. Well, I've been here about 20 minutes. I hope you guys have a good day, and be careful out there. I'll talk to you next week.